The officer said she wouldn't last. From his office window, Colonel Marcus Thorne watched the transport bus hiss to a stop, its brakes sighing in the thin, cold air of Fortitude Base. One figure disembarked. A woman, Captain Anya Voronova. Her name on the transfer orders had been unremarkable, a paper-thin file arriving a week before she did. It listed a string of staff positions, logistical analysis, administrative oversight, desk work. Thorne's lip curled. This high-altitude training facility, carved into the granite heart of the mountain range, chewed up hardened infantrymen and spit out their broken ambitions. It was no place for a paper pusher from the lowlands. He saw her pause, her face turned up towards the jagged peaks that clawed at the pale, indifferent sky. A tourist's gaze. He turned away from the window. The turning point, though he could not yet see it, was not in her arrival, but in the silence that followed it, a quiet so profound it would eventually deafen the entire command. Sergeant Major Elias Vance stood beside the colonel's desk, his own expression a careful neutral. "That's her, sir. Captain Voronova." Thorne grunted, picking up a pen and tapping it against a stack of reports. "I read her file. Not a single field command. Not one. What they're thinking, sending her here, is beyond me. This is a proving ground, Vance, not a retirement home." He looked back out the window as Voronova shouldered a standard-issue duffel bag, its weight seeming to do nothing to alter her ramrod-straight posture. She wasn't large, her frame lean and wiry under the crisp uniform. It made her look fragile against the immense, brutalist architecture of the base and the raw wilderness surrounding it. "She won't last a week," Thorne declared, the statement of final judgment. "The altitude will get her, or the first conditioning run will. Mark my words." Vance remained silent, his gaze lingering on the woman now walking with a steady, unhurried gait toward the administrative building. He had seen many soldiers arrive with bravado and swagger, only to be broken by the mountain. He had also seen quiet ones who held surprising depths. He reserved his judgment, a habit that had served him well for 30 years. Anya felt their eyes on her, a familiar pressure on the back of her neck. The stares of the soldiers loitering near the barracks were less discreet, a mixture of curiosity and dismissal. A woman, an officer they didn't know, an outsider. She ignored them, her focus on the simple mechanics of her own movement. Left foot, right foot. The air was thin, a knife's edge in her lungs, but her breathing remained even, a slow and measured rhythm she had perfected in places far colder and higher than this. She catalogued the details. The wind direction, coming down from the northeast glacier. The position of the perimeter watchtowers. The faint, rhythmic thump of the base's primary generator. Her file said she was an administrator. Her mind, however, had never stopped being an operator. Colonel Thorne did not make her wait, but the summons was a formality of condescension. She stood at attention before his wide, polished desk, the mountain peaks framed perfectly in the window behind him, a backdrop of power. He didn't offer her a seat. He steepled his fingers, his eyes scanning her as if she were a piece of faulty equipment. "Captain Voronova, your service record is..." Tidy, the word was an insult. It meant clean, sterile, untested. A lot of time behind a desk. Logistics, procurement analysis. Impressive work, I'm sure. But we don't fight wars with spreadsheets up here. Anya's face remained a placid mask. Her eyes, a cool and unsettling shade of gray, did not waver. "No, sir." Her voice was low, calm, betraying no reaction. It seemed to annoy him more than any argument could have. He wanted a reaction. He wanted her to be intimidated, to offer excuses for her neatly typed history. "Let me be clear, Captain." Thorne leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl. "This is an elite infantry training center. My men are the tip of the spear. The physical and mental demands here are extreme. I have my doubts that your background has prepared you for what's expected." He was baiting her. She knew the game. Show deference, but not weakness. "I will meet the standard, Colonel." "The standard?" Thorne laughed. A short, sharp bark. "The standard is the bare minimum for not getting shipped out in a medevac. I expect my officers to exceed the standard. I expect them to lead from the front. Can you do that? He gestured vaguely at her slender build, her immaculate uniform. Can you even keep up? The question hung in the air, thick with contempt. It wasn't a real question. It was a verdict already rendered. She held his gaze. I can. The simple two-word answer was devoid of arrogance, a statement of plain fact that held more weight than a paragraph of assurances. It only fueled his irritation. He waved a hand in dismissal. We'll see. Sergeant Major Vance will show you to your quarters. Get settled. Mandatory acclimatization run is at 0600 tomorrow. Full kit. Don't be late. He turned back to his paperwork, the interview over. As she executed a crisp about-face, she heard him speak to Vance, his voice low but deliberately carrying. A week. That's what I give her. Anya walked out of the office without a change in her expression. The colonel's words were just noise, like the wind whistling through the peaks. She had been judged by men like Thorne her entire career. They saw a woman, they saw a tidy file, and they stopped looking. They never thought to ask what might have been redacted, what stories were hidden in the white space between the lines. Their lack of imagination was not her problem. It was, she had often found, their liability. The first 48 hours were a study in quiet isolation. Anya moved through the base like a ghost, her presence barely registering. She was assigned a small Spartan officer's quarters, a concrete box with a bed, a locker, and a small desk. It was more than she'd had in other places. She unpacked with an economy of motion that was almost unnerving to watch. Each item had its place. Nothing was superfluous. Her uniforms were hung, her boots aligned perfectly beneath the bed, a single, worn book placed on the nightstand. She did not socialize. In the mess hall, she took her tray and found a small table in the corner, away from the boisterous groups of soldiers. They watched her, of course. The whispers followed her. That's the new captain, from command. Thorne says she's a pencil pusher. She ate methodically, her eyes scanning the room, not with curiosity, but with a deep, ingrained habit of assessment. She wasn't looking for friends. She was analyzing the ecosystem. She noted the subtle hierarchies, the table of cocky young lieutenants, fresh from their academies, the quieter, more watchful sergeants who were the true backbone of the unit. She saw a young private, Tanaka, struggling to keep up with the veteran's cynical banter, his eyes wide and earnest. She observed Sergeant Major Vance, who moved through the room with an air of quiet authority that dwarfed the colonel's bluster. He missed nothing. Anya's gaze would occasionally drift to the large topographical maps of the training area that lined the mess hall walls. While others talked, she studied the contour lines, the elevation markers, the designated training zones. Her mind traced routes, calculated lines of sight, identified potential ambush points and emergency shelters. She absorbed the terrain, committing it to memory. It was a language she understood better than small talk. One afternoon, she took a walk along the inner perimeter fence, her pace steady. She wasn't exercising. She was observing. She noted the blind spots in the camera coverage, the predictable patrol patterns of the guards, the section of fence where drifting snow created a natural ramp against the wire. She stored the information away without conscious thought. A mental file created and categorized under base infiltration/exfiltration routes. It was a game she played to keep her mind sharp, a holdover from a life she was supposed to have left behind. She saw Private Tanaka later, struggling with a gear check, his pack contents strewn on the ground. Older soldiers walked past, some offering a quick, unhelpful jest. Anya paused beside him. "Your weight is unbalanced," she said, her voice even. Tanaka looked up, startled. "Ma'am," she pointed. "Your hydration bladder is on the left, but so are your spare rations and ammunition. Shift the water to the center, close to your spine. Distribute the dense items evenly around it. It will feel 10 pounds lighter." She didn't wait for a thank you. She just continued her walk, leaving the young private staring after her, a thoughtful frown on his face as he began to rearrange his pack. It was the most she had spoken to anyone. To others, she was aloof, distant. But to the few who were truly watching, like Vance, These small, quiet moments were beginning to form a picture that didn't quite match the one in her file. The pressure arrived just before dawn, as promised. The announcement crackled over the base-wide PA system, Thorne's voice smug and sharp. Attention all personnel. Mandatory unit conditioning run, 0600 hours. Full combat gear including pack, weapon, and helmet. Route is the Omega Ridge Loop. 5 miles. 1,800 feet of elevation gain. See you at the finish line. A collective groan rippled through the barracks. Omega Ridge was a beast. A trail known for its brutal, unrelenting incline and treacherous footing. Doing it in full kit, especially before being fully acclimatized to the altitude, was a form of punishment. It was Thorne's favorite tool for weeding out the weak. In the staging area, the air was thick with the sounds of clinking gear and nervous coughing. Soldiers cinched down straps, checked their rifles, and stretched stiff muscles in the pre-dawn gloom. The cold was biting, and the thin air made every breath a conscious effort. Anya moved through the controlled chaos with a serene calm. She adjusted her pack. The weight settled perfectly across her hips and shoulders, just as she'd advised Tanaka. Her rifle was secured, her helmet snug. She performed a series of slow, deliberate breathing exercises, her eyes half closed. In hold out, she was regulating her heart rate, preparing her body for the oxygen debt to come. Private Tanaka, his pack now properly balanced, watched her with a newfound curiosity. He saw no fear in her, no anxiety, only focus. Sergeant Major Vance stood near the starting line, his arms crossed, his gaze sweeping over the assembled company. He saw the usual mix of bravado and dread. Then he saw Captain Voronova. She stood alone, slightly apart from the other officers, a still point in the swirling activity. She looked smaller than everyone else in her gear, yet there was an unnerving solidity to her stance. The first signs of real strain appeared before the unit had even gone half a mile. The initial section of the trail was a steep, gravel-strewn path that climbed relentlessly. Lungs unused to the 10,000-foot altitude burned. The lieutenants, eager to impress, shot out at a blistering pace, their youthful arrogance overriding common sense. Within minutes, they were gasping, their faces flushed. Panic began to set in for the younger soldiers. Dizziness, nausea. The crushing weight of the pack felt like a physical assault. One private stumbled, falling to his knees, vomiting onto the trail. His squad leader hauled him up, shouting encouragement that sounded more like a threat. The unit's cohesion began to fray, the column stretching out as the fittest pulled ahead and the strugglers fell behind. It was exactly what Thorne had intended. He wanted to break them down to expose the weakest links, and he was certain Voronova would be one of them. Anya did not sprint. She started near the back of the pack, her pace deliberate, almost placid. It was a steady, rhythmic cadence, a ground-eating stride that seemed to require no effort at all. Her breathing was inaudible, a stark contrast to the ragged gasps and heaving chests around her. For the first mile, she was simply an anonymous figure among many. Then she began to move. She didn't speed up. It was more that her pace never faltered, while everyone else's decayed. She passed the first stragglers, the ones who had gone out too fast and burned out. She offered no words, just a steady presence moving past them in the dim light. She came upon Private Tanaka, who was leaning against a rock, his face pale, his breath coming in ragged sobs. He was hyperventilating, his panic compounding the effects of the altitude. "Breathe with me," Anya said, her voice calm, and even as she came alongside him without breaking stride. He looked at her, his eyes wide with distress. "Ma'am, I can't." "Yes, you can," she stated simply. "Through your nose. For counts in. Hold for 4. Out through your mouth for 6. Match my count." She began to count aloud, her voice a low metronome. "In 2, 3, 4. Hold 2, 3, 4. Out 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-inch Tanaka, desperate, tried to follow. His first few attempts were ragged, but her steady voice anchored him. Slowly, his breathing began to regulate. The frantic edge of his panic subsided. "Keep that rhythm," she said. Don't look at the top. Look at the ground 10 feet in front of you. Just get to there. She didn't slow for him. She continued her inexorable climb, leaving him with the tools to save himself. And then she began to pass the main body of the unit. She moved past fire teams, then whole squads. The soldiers, laboring under the strain, would hear a soft, steady crunch of gravel approaching from behind. They would turn to see her, her face impassive, her stride economical, and then she would be gone, moving up the trail like a machine. She passed the sergeants, the seasoned veterans who prided themselves on their endurance. She passed the arrogant lieutenants, now red-faced and humbled, their early sprint a distant memory. Finally, as the ridge flattened out near the summit, she caught up to the two pace-setters, a pair of reconnaissance specialists known for their phenomenal fitness. They were running hard, competing with each other. They heard her approach and glanced back, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and shock. Anya drew level with them. She gave them a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and then pulled ahead. She didn't increase her speed. She simply maintained the same relentless pace that had carried her from the very beginning. It was they who could not keep up. She crossed the designated finish line alone. Colonel Thorne was there, a thermos of coffee in his hand, a stopwatch in the other. He looked up as she approached, his mouth opening slightly in astonishment. He checked his watch, then looked at her again. She wasn't gasping for air. She wasn't even sweating heavily. A light sheen of moisture was on her temples, but her breathing was deep and controlled. Without a word, she unslung her rifle, placed it carefully on the ground, and began a series of cool-down stretches, as calm as if she had just finished a light jog in a city park. 10 minutes later, the first of the reconnaissance specialists stumbled across the line, collapsing to his knees. Then came the rest of the unit, in ragged groups and as exhausted individuals, their faces masks of pain and relief. They all saw her, Captain Voronova, the paper pusher, standing there waiting, looking as if she could do it all over again. The shift was not sudden, but it was undeniable. It began in the mess hall that evening. When Anya entered, the usual low hum of conversation didn't just dip. It stopped. For a second, there was silence. Every eye was on her, but the looks were different now. The dismissal was gone, replaced by a potent cocktail of awe, confusion, and a healthy dose of fear. The whispers that followed were of a different nature. "Did you see her? She didn't even break a sweat," Sarge said. "She passed them at the summit like they were standing still." She helped Tanaka, showed him how to breathe. Anya took her tray and sat at her usual solitary table. But this time something changed. A few moments later, Private Tanaka, looking hesitant but determined, approached her table. "Ma'am, is this seat taken?" Anya looked up from her meal, her gray eyes meeting his. She gave a single, brief nod. Tanaka sat down, his tray rattling slightly in his nervous hands. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, thank you, for this morning. I don't think I would have made it." "You would have," Anya replied, her tone factual, not complimentary. "You just needed to regulate your system. Panic is a choice." The conversation was stilted, but it was a start. It broke the seal of her isolation. Soon, other soldiers, emboldened by Tanaka's move, began to approach her, not with familiarity, but with a cautious respect. They asked questions about gear, about high-altitude conditioning, about her breathing technique. She answered them in short, direct, practical terms. She offered no personal stories, no boasts. She gave them data. Sergeant Major Vance watched the scene from his own table. He had seen the results of the run. Voronova hadn't just finished first. She had beaten the previous record for the Omega Ridge Loop, set 5 years ago by a Special Forces candidate, by nearly 3 minutes. And she had done it without appearing to try. He walked over to her table after she had finished her meal. "Captain," he said, his voice a low rumble. Anya stood. "Sergeant Major, that was an impressive performance this morning." It was high praise from Vance, a man who measured his words carefully. "I was acclimatized," she said simply, as if that explained everything. But Vance knew better. He had been on this base for a decade. He knew what acclimatization looked like. This was something else entirely. "We have a multi-day field exercise starting next week," he said. "Squad-level tactics, mountain environment. The colonel has assigned you as an observer and evaluator for 3rd Platoon." He was watching her closely, gauging her reaction. It was a test. Being an evaluator was an officer's job, but it was also a way to keep her on the sidelines. Anya's expression didn't change. "I understand," but as she walked away, Vance saw a flicker of something in her eyes. It wasn't disappointment. It was patience. The kind of patience a predator has when it knows its time to hunt will come. Colonel Thorne was furious. His attempt to publicly humiliate Voronova had backfired spectacularly. He was now the subject of quiet ridicule among his own senior NCOs. His prediction of a week had become a running joke. He sat in his office, staring at her file again, as if the paper itself could explain the impossible reality of what had happened. Logistics, administration, supply chain management. It made no sense. It was a lie. He just couldn't figure out why. The field training exercise began under a sky of bruised purple clouds. The forecast called for light snow at high elevations, nothing the unit couldn't handle. 3rd Platoon, led by a capable but young lieutenant named Davies, moved out with Anya trailing them as the designated evaluator. She carried the same gear as everyone else, her role as an observer a fiction as far as her physical load was concerned. For 2 days, things went by the book. They practiced patrols, set up defensive positions, and ran simulated casualty drills. Anya remained in the background, her notepad in hand, making quiet observations. She noted that Davies, while tactically sound, relied too heavily on his GPS. She saw that his squad's communication discipline was sloppy, filled with unnecessary chatter. She watched the sky, her gaze lingering on the unnatural stillness of the air, the strange, yellowish light. The veterans knew the signs. "Storm's coming," one of them muttered. "A bad one." It hit on the second night, and it was far worse than any forecast. The light snow became a blinding wall of white. The wind howled down from the peaks, a physical force that ripped at tents and stole the breath. Visibility dropped to 0. The temperature plummeted. It was a full-blown blizzard, a whiteout. Back at Fortitude Base, the command center became a hub of controlled panic. Colonel Thorne stared at the tactical map, where the GPS trackers for most units were holding steady in their designated bivouac sites. But one was missing. 3rd Platoon. Their signal had vanished an hour ago. "Get them on the radio," Thorne barked at the comms specialist. "Sir, I've been trying," the soldier replied, his voice tight with stress. "The storm is playing hell with the frequencies." "It's all static." Lieutenant Davies's voice finally broke through, a desperate, fragmented shout swallowed by the roar of the wind. "Lost visibility 0, 1 man down, possible leg fracture. GPS is out, requesting." The signal died, dissolving into a hiss of static. Thorne slammed his fist on the console. They were lost. A full squad, somewhere in the teeth of a blizzard with an injured man. Protocol dictated they hold their position and wait for the storm to break. A rescue attempt in these conditions was suicidal. But waiting could also be a death sentence. The men would freeze. Thorne was paralyzed, caught between 2 catastrophic options. The command center was a cacophony of urgent, useless suggestions. Launch a drone. Send out a search party. He shouted them all down. It was too dangerous. They would wait. Into this chaos, Anya Voronova walked. She had returned to the base with another platoon an hour before the storm had peaked. Her own evaluation cut short. She had heard the frantic radio traffic. She stood now before Thorne, her face calm, her uniform dusted with snow. "Colonel," she said, her voice cutting through the noise, "I know where they are." All heads in the command center turned toward her. The room fell silent, the only sound the howling of the wind outside the reinforced windows. Colonel Thorne stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and irritation. "What did you say, Captain?" "I know where they are," she repeated, her voice steady. She moved to the large topographical map on the wall, the same one she had studied in the mess hall. Her finger traced a path. Lieutenant Davies was heading for Checkpoint Zulu when the storm hit. His last transmission reported a man down. Standard procedure is to find immediate, hard shelter. The GPS failed. He would revert to map and compass. She tapped a specific point on the map. The terrain here is a funnel. The wind is coming from the northeast. It would have driven them southwest. They would have been looking for a terrain feature to block the wind. 3/4 of a mile from their last known position, there is a series of granite overhangs. An old shepherd's shelter. It's not on the standard military maps, but it's there. That's where you'll find them. Thorn gaped at her. How in God's name could you possibly know that? He demanded. It's a guess. A blind guess. It is a tactical assessment based on terrain, weather, and a doctrinal understanding of a junior officer's decision-making process under extreme duress. She corrected him, her tone clinical. He will choose the most logical path to the most logical shelter. That is the 1-inch. Thorn's face was turning a dangerous shade of red. He was being upstaged. His authority challenged in front of his entire command staff by the very woman he had dismissed. And what makes you an expert on unconventional shelter and Arctic survival, Captain? Your background is in supply chain management. The dam of her patience finally showed a microscopic crack. Not in her face, but in the chilling stillness of her eyes. My specialization, Colonel, she said, her voice dropping slightly, was deep cover operations and unconventional extraction. Often in Arctic and high-altitude environments, the statement hung in the air, a grenade with the pin pulled. Thorn was speechless. He pointed a trembling finger at her. Who are you? He whispered, the question now holding genuine, fearful curiosity. Sergeant Major, Anya said, turning to Vance, ignoring the colonel. I need a 4-man volunteer team. Snowmobiles, medical kits, thermal gear. We can be ready in 20 minutes. Vance didn't even look at Thorn for approval. He saw the truth in her eyes. I'm one, he said. Tanaka, you're with me. Get 2 more. As Vance and the others hurried to gear up, Thorn stumbled back to his desk, his mind reeling. He barked at his aide. Get me Captain Voronova's full service record, the sealed file, security code Alpha 9 Omega. Now! While Anya was outside, personally checking the equipment on the snowmobiles, her hands moving with practiced expertise, the aide placed a thin, red-bordered folder on Thorn's desk. He opened it. Most of it was redacted, black lines obscuring missions, locations, and unit designations. But there were flashes. Commendations for valor under extreme circumstances. Cross-service honors from Allied Special Operations units he'd only heard of in rumors. And then he saw the cover name for her last assignment. A unit so clandestine most of the military believed it was a myth. A ghost story told to frighten new recruits. Project Cerberus. Her operational specialty was listed in stark, terrifying clarity. Solo infiltration, asset extraction, and counterterrorism in denied areas. Below, it was her call sign. Cassandra. Thorn felt a cold dread wash over him. Cassandra, the ghost of the North. A legendary operative credited with a dozen impossible successes. A figure who could supposedly survive for weeks behind enemy lines with nothing but a knife and the clothes on her back. He had thought it was a campfire story. He looked out the window at the woman in the swirling snow, pulling on a thermal helmet. He hadn't been sent a paper pusher. He had been sent a weapon, and he had treated her like a child. Anya led the small rescue team out into the blizzard. She didn't rely on instruments. She navigated by instinct, by the feel of the wind, the slope of the unseen ground beneath the snowmobile's tracks, and the map she had memorized in her mind. Sergeant Major Vance drove behind her, his decades of experience screaming that this was madness. Yet he followed without question. He had seen her on the ridge. He had heard her in the command center. He was a believer now. Young Tanaka, riding behind Vance, was terrified, but his fear was overshadowed by his absolute faith in the quiet captain leading them into the white void. They found the lost squad exactly where Anya had said they would be. Huddled under a deep granite overhang, they had managed to build a small snow cave to shield them from the worst of the wind. They were freezing, exhausted, and scared, but they were alive. The injured soldier was in bad shape, his leg crudely splinted, but he was conscious. Lieutenant Davies looked at Anya with wide, tear-filled eyes, his youthful confidence completely shattered. How did you find us?" Anya didn't answer. She was already working, directing Vance and the others in administering first aid, distributing thermal blankets and hot rations. Her movements were efficient, her commands brief and precise. She was in her element. The return trip was a slow, grueling ordeal, towing the injured man on a rescue sled. Anya took the lead again, cutting a path through the still raging storm. Hours later, as the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the blizzard, the faint outlines of Fortitude Base appeared ahead of them. The storm was finally starting to break. As their small convoy passed through the main gate, they saw that the base was not asleep. A crowd was waiting for them in the open space in front of the command building. Soldiers who were off-duty, cooks from the mess hall, mechanics from the motor pool. They stood in the biting cold, their parkas pulled tight, waiting. They had heard the story, passed through the comms network and the barracks grapevine. The paper pusher had gone out into the storm. She had found the lost men. At the front of the crowd stood Colonel Thorne. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. He had been standing there for hours. Anya brought her snowmobile to a halt and dismounted. She was covered in snow and ice, her face raw from the wind, but she stood as straight as she had the day she arrived. She began to walk toward the command building to make her report, expecting the crowd to part and let her pass. But they remained still. As she drew level with Colonel Thorne, he did something that stunned every person on the base. He said nothing. He simply brought his hand up in a slow, deliberate, perfect salute. It wasn't the perfunctory gesture an officer gives a subordinate. It was the salute of a soldier to a superior, a mark of profound and absolute respect. A gesture that acknowledged a debt that could not be repaid with words. For a moment there was silence. Then Sergeant Major Vance, standing by his snowmobile, rendered his own salute. Then Lieutenant Davies, leaning on one of his men. Then, one by one, every soldier in the crowd raised a hand to their brow. They saluted her not as Captain Voronova, the new officer. They saluted her as a savior. Anya paused. She looked at Thorne, then at the sea of faces, and saw the complete and total reversal of their judgment. She returned the colonel's salute with a crisp, correct motion, held it for a beat, and then continued on her way. A week later, a quiet normalcy had returned to Fortitude Base, but the underlying dynamics had been forever altered. The name Voronova was no longer a subject of gossip, but of legend. The soldiers gave her a wide berth, not from fear or dislike, but from a kind of reverence. They treated her like a monument, something to be respected from a slight distance. She was no longer the outsider. She was the standard. Anya, for her part, seemed unchanged by the event. She resumed her quiet routine, her solitary meals, her long walks along the perimeter. She did not seek out the respect she had earned, nor did she seem to bask in it. It was simply a new condition of her environment, one she noted and adapted to. She had been assigned a new role, no longer a mere observer. Thorne had quietly given her oversight of all high-risk training, her recommendations now treated as gospel. One morning at dawn, she was on the rifle range, alone. The air was crystal clear, the sun just beginning to crest the eastern peaks, painting the snow in hues of orange and pink. She lay in the prone position, her breathing slow and even, her rifle steady. She wasn't practicing. She was meditating, the familiar ritual, a way of centering herself. She heard the crunch of boots in the snow behind her. It was Private Tanaka. He didn't speak. He walked to the lane next to hers, unslung his own rifle and lay down. He didn't try to engage her in conversation. He simply tried to emulate her. He copied her posture, tried to match her breathing, tried to achieve the same stillness. It was the purest form of respect he could offer, the desire to learn by observation. A few minutes later, Sergeant Major Vance walked by on his morning inspection of the base. He saw the two of them, the living legend and her silent apprentice. He paused, watching them for a long moment. He caught Anya's eye. She gave a slight nod. He returned it, a silent acknowledgement between two professionals, and continued on his way. Anya turned her attention back to the target, 500 meters downrange. She exhaled slowly, her finger tightening on the trigger. The rifle cracked, a sharp report that echoed off the silent mountains. The brass casing ejected, a small, gleaming arc of gold in the morning sun, landing softly on the pristine snow. It was a perfect shot. She was where she belonged, a quiet, competent force in a world of noise and chaos. The officer had said she wouldn't last. The officer had been wrong. Her dignity was intact, her place earned, and her silence was now the most respected voice on the base.